if I had to listen to two different voices, I think I would shut off the voice of Robert Kennedy Jr. and I'd listen to the voice of that child crying out.
Thanks for joining the Father Emmanuel Lemelson Podcast, which reveals the darkest corners of government, corporate America, and culture with commentary from an Orthodox Christian perspective. Join our co-host, Theodora Lemelson, for another thought-provoking episode as we explore the question, will the federal legalization of marijuana end addiction, as some have advocated?
In 2014, a shocking video emerged showing the moment an innocent child snaps in an attempt to awaken his mother from an apparent drug-induced trance. The person who originally posted the video on Instagram states that the child's mother is, quote, high. The same video recently re-emerged and circulated on social media. In the footage, the boy, said to be age 9 at the time, repeatedly strikes his mother in the face as she sits motionless on a step surrounded by other people. He repeatedly implores, with his voice pouring out with emotion, quote, "Mommy, wake up, Mommy." As the woman sways with her eyes closed, the boy cries out again, quote, "Mommy, will you talk? Will you talk to me?" End quote. This is truly heartbreaking. Take a look.
Mommy, wake up! You want to my mommy? You talk! You talk! You talk to me!
Yo!
This is such an incredibly painful video to watch. It touched me in my core. And I think I understand this child's pain. He's saying to his mother, talk to me, because he sees in his mother a woman who's dying before his very eyes. Not necessarily physically dying in that moment, but her soul is being wiped away. It's imprisoned, actually. She's being put behind a veil of addiction where she can barely see her own son. And I think I understand this child's pain. And I wish every American would watch this video of this child to understand the evil, the absolute, complete, unequivocal evil of drugs. Don't kid yourself. If this woman's on an opioid like heroin or fentanyl, she didn't start there. She probably started with something that seemed much more innocuous, much more harmless, like marijuana. But all addictions lead to this place, and they all have a common theme that we're going to somehow avoid the pain of life. We're going to avoid the loneliness, this emptiness inside, this isolation from one another, and that certainly this isolation from God. And we're going to just temporarily take it away with alcohol or marijuana or something more powerful later on down the road. And that is a grave error. It's a mistake to think that through our own will, we can sort of displace what we really need in our life, which is a dependence on God's grace and God's mercy and communion with Him. And through communion with Him, communion with our fellow man. Because when we're satisfied that way, when we're satisfied intellectually, when we're satisfied emotionally, in those relationships, we don't need to fill our body with anything else. And this example, aside from being so incredibly painful, is incredibly poignant, because what is more powerful than the love of a mother? And this woman cannot love her son because her freedom has been robbed from her. Her freedom has been robbed from her by addiction. She's living in darkness. She's living in a prison, a dark place. And the child, of course, he's not really striking his mother. He can't articulate it, and his mind is not fully developed, but he's really striking back at these demons of addiction and this thing that he cannot give a predicate to. He can't articulate it, but he's crying out in love, because the love of a child for their parent is just as strong as a parent's love for their child. Because for a 9-year-old, the parent is like God. And you look at this video and you ask yourself, where is the father? That's the first question. And then you see this other child, an even younger child, sitting next to her. And they're sitting in the midst of these people. And I think of the words of Christ, and I think it's Matthew 18, 1-3. And the disciples come to Christ and they say, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And what does Christ do? He pulls amidst them a child. And he says, unless you turn and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Turn, as in change of mind, as in repentance, to become innocent. This child's heart is innocent. Don't be distracted by his flailing arms, his striking his mother, which is horrible. Horrible that it's come to that. the most basic thing to honor your mother and father. But this child should never have been in this situation where he's feeling the role of an adult at the age of 9, and he's up against a demon and a darkness which he has no hope of fighting on his own. And I wonder where this child is today. I wish I could know him. He must be 19 now. And I wish I could know the mother. I want to know what happened to these people, where they're at. Maybe this video, by some act of God, will make its way to them. But listen to his voice. Make yourself watch this video, as painful as it is. Because if there's any doubt about the lies of drug use, if there's any doubt about the lies of addiction, which we've subdued strangely in our society now for years, decades really, that video should show you the reality. It should cut through the rhetoric. It should cut through the legalese of powerful lobbyists in DC who have made drugs so normative. I mean, certainly marijuana is widely available now to Americans, and we're talking about making other more powerful drugs, psychedelics, widely available, notwithstanding the harm they do to the mind, notwithstanding the harm they do to the soul, because it catalyzes a sort of selfishness. It catalyzes a sense of reliance on self, and it takes us away from the source of life. The source of life is really an understanding that we depend on God's grace and God's mercy. And we do that. We take our sense of perspective outside of ourself, and we can put it on the other. We can even pray for that, because at the heart of addiction, all of these addictions, is this sense of resentment, I think. And there's a sense of despair. And there, of course, once there's a pharmacological or a substance or a chemical substance that there's actually a physical addiction to, it gets so much more complicated. And when there's harm to the mind, to the intellect, to the brain, those problems are just compounded. But here, look at these painful and sad instance, and let that be a wake-up. Let that shatter the nonsense in our society that drugs are okay, because it always leads to the same place. The substance, and we use words like substance misuse now, or substance misuse disorder, as if we remove personal agency from it completely, as if we remove our free will, as if we remove our decisions, the ability to be either virtuous in our decisions or to be filled with vice. We cannot do that. There is a point where drug use is a decision. And if we don't take ownership of that, if we don't get the language right, if we don't get back to virtue, if we don't get back to the real description of what substance abuse is, then we cannot heal. Certainly those afflicted with drug addiction, with addiction in general, won't heal if we rob them even of the right words to think about it. So we have to get back to this idea that a choice was made, that we are sinful, that we succumb at some point, we gave in to a temptation that was made to look attractive. And the cost of that decision was higher than maybe the person realized when they made that decision, when they gave into it. But the answer isn't to rebrand it as some sort of misuse disorder. A disorder could be something you could inherit at birth, for crying out loud. These are decisions ultimately, as all sin is. It's a decision to give in to a temptation. And in this case, to give into the temptation that we can buy ourselves some comfort, that we can forego pain, that we can forego suffering, that we can forego loneliness, that we can forego emptiness, that we can forego depression, that we can forego desolation, if we would only take this or that substance. But that leads to such an incredibly ugly place. And so, I see some of these podcasters today talking so casually about drug use. I see Joe Rogan and Elon Musk, who would otherwise should be a great role model for young aspiring entrepreneurs, making light of drug use. Lex Friedman, and on his podcast, this sort of normal discussion and even talking about it as if it were going to be some sort of spiritual experience, an unlocking of the mind, and some sort of special spiritual insight, is nothing but pure darkness. If you have to choose between listening to those folks and listening to this 9-year-old child, choose the child, because in the cry of his voice, like one crying out in the desert, you'll hear the truth. And let me tell you, you might think you're in the forest and you hear a lion roar, but it just turns out to be a cat. But when you hear a lion roar, you know damn well it's a lion. Let that child's voice be like a lion roaring on the evils of addiction, on the evil of substance abuse, because it's only growing in our society like just one of many plagues. And it comes with an especially difficult price price of permanent damage to our ability to think.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., an independent 2024 presidential candidate, asserts the U.S. needs to, quote, legalize pot to end addiction, saying, quote, what I've advocated is that we should legalize marijuana. We should have a federal tax on marijuana that is designated specifically for drug treatment and rehabilitation, and I want to build, as part of my presidency, a series of renewal centers of detoxification, essentially centers around this country to treat the rise in mental illness and PTSD and drug addiction that is debilitating our children, end quote. Additionally, Kennedy called for reform to ensure that cannabis businesses can, quote, bank their profit and their revenues, end quote, rather than operate on a cash-only basis that, according to him, quote, encourages more crime. Kennedy added that he believes in, quote, personal freedoms. According to some estimates, the global cannabis market was valued at more than $43 billion in 2022. It's estimated to have grown to about $57 billion in 2023, and is projected to reach a revenue of almost $65 billion in 2024. North America dominated the global market with a share of almost 82% in 2022. At the same time, in 2023, the drug overdose death rate in the U.S. topped 112,000 for the first time, according to the CDC. That's an increase of about fourfold since 2002. With that much revenue generated, is this really about, quote, ending addiction or discouraging, quote, more crime? Is there a conflict of interest here? What are your thoughts?
Based on what evidence would legalizing cannabis or marijuana lead to lower crime rates? That's absurd. Based on what evidence would legalizing cannabis eliminate addiction? That's even more absurd. The great French playwright Honoré de Balzac once said that behind every great fortune is a great crime. And I often think that people who advocate for the legalization of certain unethical and immoral practices perhaps do so, if even subconsciously, to justify, to make themselves feel better about their own decisions in life. I often think that advocates of abortion, for example, may feel better about themselves if abortion were legal or widely accepted on a social basis. Maybe Robert Kennedy Jr. will somehow feel better about his own struggles with addiction if it's legalized. Maybe in hindsight he can look back and say his choices weren't so bad. I can't imagine this man believes what he's saying. What he's suggesting is like saying we should perhaps bring back the transorbital lobotomy and tax the procedure so we can open centers to treat traumatic brain injury. It's ridiculous. It should be obvious to anybody now that over the last 30 years there's been a very shrewd and well-funded campaign by lobbyists to make marijuana use more socially acceptable, more normative in society. And we see these statistics coming out now where a larger and larger percentage of the population says that they have tried using it at least once. I want to say in 2006, the percentage of the population who had indicated they'd used marijuana at least once, I think was 10%, and I want to say by 2017 that had risen to 15%. Presently, I think there's 7,000 dispensaries in the country. 200 million Americans live in a state where there's marijuana is approved for medicinal or recreational use. I think those lines are increasingly blurred. But what's being lost in the mix, that this idea that marijuana is harmless, is the fact that it actually leads to greater and greater incidence of mental illness, to paranoia, to depression, and to psychosis, including schizophrenia. And that is often associated with violence, quite frankly. The idea that it's this harmless drug, that, to quote Kamala Harris, when she was asked if she had used cannabis in her college years, I think she replied that cannabis brings a lot of joy into the world, and we need more joy in this world, or something to that effect. But her categories are completely incorrect. They're wrong. First of all, cannabis, it triggers the pleasure centers in the brain, has nothing to do with joy, and there's a big difference between pleasure and joy. Pleasure is something we pursue. You go out, you buy marijuana, you smoke it. Joy is something that we set the preconditions for and we let into our lives. And that's an incredibly misleading statement for her to make, as if it were somehow this harmless drug. In fact, there have been studies going back a very long time. For example, I think there are studies going back 150 years showing in British registries of mental health clinics and sanatoriums in India, showing the relationship between cannabis use and crime and violence and so forth. I recall a study I recently read that showed, it was a study I think of 6,000, I want to say, British and Chinese men, if memory serves me correctly. And in overwhelming number of those cases where they had committed crimes, cannabis use was a common factor, a common feature in those people's lives. We're now seeing studies coming out of Denmark and Finland, much more accurate studies, more comprehensive studies between the relationship between cannabis use and mental illness and mental health that is strangely absent in the United States. It's not part of an official registry. And the results are really overwhelmingly clear that cannabis use changes the structure of the brain, especially long-term cannabis use, let's say 6 to 8 years. It depletes the density of the gray matter in the brain, especially in the orbital frontal cortex. And so this analogy that it's almost like a lobotomy it may seem extreme at first, but there's some truth to it as well. Because in diminishing the density of that gray matter, you're really affecting the part of the mind that deals with the ability to make decisions, to make judgments. And you see these young people who are living in states like Washington State or Colorado, which I think in 2014 were some of the first states to legalize marijuana. And then it was followed, I want to say, by Alaska and in 2015. And if you look at some of the studies coming out, Alaska and Oregon, I believe, if you look at the studies in 2015, if you look at the studies coming out of these states, you see dramatic increases actually in violent crime and assaults and murders. This idea that we're just going to overlook that data is absurd. And now we have a vast majority of Americans living in states where it's legal, and there's this idea of it's socially normative. There's a powerful, well-funded lobbying group, understandably, trying to make Americans believe it's harmless, that it's this recreational thing like going camping, for example. No harm, no foul. And we're overlooking the mental health crisis. We're overlooking the relationship to violence. You know, people look at opioids, they look at heroin, and they say, well, this leads to horrible deaths, overdose, this sort of super synthetic heroin, this opioid fentanyl, which is killing people. But we're overlooking the fact that marijuana and its key stimulative ingredient, THC, is leading to these fundamental changes in brain structure that exacerbates certainly the possibility for psychosis, and for those living with conditions like schizophrenia already, it's leading to violent behaviors and violent crime. It's leading to homicides. I think there was a study in Australia, I want to say, that was done not too long ago, and I believe it studied 88 homicide cases, and I think in the overwhelming number of those cases, the people who committed those homicides believed they were paranoid. They believed that the victims of those crimes were somehow after them, and virtually all of them were cannabis users. I think in many of the school shootings, high-profile shootings we've had in the United States, I remember the shooting with Gabby Giffords, and a number of others in the United States. Many of those assailants were active cannabis users, but that's often kept out of the media. Why? So why would that be kept out of the media? Well, it would be kept out of the media because it's a 40, a 50, a 60 billion, and God knows what it will be in 10 years business. And there's a lot of money to be made, and I don't think Robert Kennedy Jr. I don't think that point is lost on him. So let me just say, he's not going to win the election. And it's disappointing that he would make these comments, which I cannot believe a smart man like him would genuinely believe. But we have to say the truth about marijuana. It's a gateway drug. It's a stepping stone drug. We've eliminated that from our vocabulary in recent decades, especially the last 20 years. Nobody goes straight to using heroin, let's be honest. They usually start with marijuana. And where does it lead? It leads to that poor child, that 9-year-old. And it leads to the condition, the almost catatonic state his mother was in. And if I had to listen to two different voices, I think I would shut off the voice of Robert Kennedy Jr. and I'd listen to the voice of that child crying out because addiction is evil. And what's going on with marijuana in our society now with cannabis it's a crime, frankly. It's a big business and it's creating great fortunes. And you look at what's going on with these strains they're breeding now of cannabis, where the THC levels are, I guess, something like 800% higher than they were in the 1960s. And that's not good enough, I guess, for some of these young people who think it's just okay. They're getting these dabs and these other concentrated forms, candies and so forth, where the THC levels are 20x what they were at that time. And in some cases, it's just pure THC. And you imagine sort of these young developing minds where they need their prefrontal cortex, they need the ability to make judgments, and it's being diminished dramatically and permanently, and they're being left with profound mental illness. Psychosis is no minor issue. We're not talking about a neurosis, we're talking about a psychosis. We're talking about permanent changes in brain function. You look at these studies coming from the National Institute of Health, the prevalence of mental illness. I think 42% of young students feel feelings of sadness or hopelessness, depression. Well, that's linked to marijuana. You look at 29%, I think, a full third have identified with some sort of full-fledged mental illness. I think another study from the NIH said that I believe it's one in 5 students had contemplated suicide, had suicidal ideation, and other incredible statistic. I actually almost couldn't believe it. It was 1 in 10 had actually attempted suicide, made a sincere attempt. I believe something like 1 in 5 Americans are living with mental health issues. But yeah, let's legalize marijuana. Let's flood the country with more of it and make it sure that any stigma formerly associated with it is eliminated. And why do those stigmas exist? They exist for a reason, because it's harmful. It's incredibly harmful in a way that alcohol isn't. Alcohol is harmful. All addictions are harmful. I don't want to downplay the harmful effects of alcohol addiction. But any psychosomatic substance, any chemical that passes the blood-brain barrier and causes permanent changes to the brain, I'm not talking about just merely killing neurons and killing off the brain cells, but changing the structure of the mind is particularly evil. And I think Robert Kennedy Jr. said in some of those quotes that he was going to open centers for renewal and detoxification. Well, it is a neurotoxin, but how do you undo the damage to the brain, Robert? How are you going to do that? And you're going to tax it? That's brilliant. That's like taxing casinos and saying this will open centers for gambling addiction. Well, why don't we just legalize pedophilia and we'll tax it, and then we can open centers to treat pedophiles? Completely absurd. And in that entire cycle, it's a cycle of grift. It's a cycle of skimming. Everyone's making a cut. Yeah, well, let's bank them. Well, you know what? I'm not sure I've seen any real tangible evidence of a relationship between transaction being done on a cash basis and crime. I happen to live in a country where they still use cash all the time, and they have one of the lowest crime rates in the world. So what's in it for the banks? Well, I guess 50, 60 billion in deposits, right? I'm sure that they would be your best friend if you made it into office, but you won't. Because that's a completely disingenuous thing you just told us. It's a completely disingenuous thing you just told the American public. And it's shameful. And we got to get back to speaking the truth, because that's total bullshit about marijuana, and it's hurting young people. I have yet to meet a young person who regularly smokes marijuana and is mentally acute. And as far back as I can remember, and going back to my youth, when I knew other young people who would use marijuana, it was a different beast back then. It was a fraction of the potency it is today. So what's happening to these young people today? The ones I meet, in the state of Vermont, for example, where we're so quick to open dispensaries. It's so clear their mental illness. It's so clear the struggles they're having. We need to tie, in real honest terms, this business, this social norming, really, of marijuana use to our epidemic of mental health problems, to our crisis of mental health in our country, and to the crisis of violence, to the crisis of lawlessness, because there's a direct link. And if we have to look to Australian studies, and if we have to look to Danish studies, and if we have to look to Finnish studies, fine. If we're not going to do it in the U.S. But there's enough in the U.S. anyways to see clearly what this is doing. And we don't need another big business. We don't need that kind of business. It's destroying us from the inside as a country. It's destroying the soul of our country because it's destroying the soul of us as individuals. It's destroying our interior life. Addiction is a very ugly demon. And I've seen it firsthand, way up close. And I know the harm it does. And don't listen to politicians. Listen to the voice of the children. Because if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must become like them. That's what Christ tells us. Like this 9-year-old boy who doesn't even have a name. That's who we need to listen to. Look at the pain it's causing. Open your eyes, open your ears, and just listen. We don't need any more drugs in our society. We don't need any more drugs in our country. It's evil.